If you have both ADHD and autism, your brain manages a constant neurological contradiction. The dopamine dysregulation that drives ADHD creates a persistent search for stimulation and novelty, while autism involves heightened sensory sensitivity and a nervous system that functions best with predictability and routine. These aren't just conflicting preferences, they appear to be competing neurological drives that require energy to resolve every day in nearly every decision. When this system becomes overwhelmed, the resulting burnout follows a different pattern than either condition alone. It's deeper, more systemic, and follows recovery timelines that standard burnout frameworks don't account for. Most burnout recovery advice assumes a straightforward model: overextend yourself, rest adequately, return to baseline functioning. Mental health resources typically address ADHD burnout and autistic burnout as separate phenomena with distinct recovery approaches. But people living with both conditions, increasingly referred to in neurodivergent communities as AuDHD, though this remains primarily community terminology rather than formal diagnostic language, often find their burnout doesn't follow these established patterns. You rest for weeks or months, eliminate stressors, step back from responsibilities, yet the exhaustion persists. Executive function remains impaired long after you'd expect recovery. Tasks that were manageable before the crash now feel overwhelming. You may lose previously developed skills, the ability to tolerate sensory environments you once managed, to navigate social situations that were previously routine, to switch between activities without complete cognitive shutdown. This isn't inadequate self-care. The assumption that dual diagnosis simply means more intense versions of the same symptoms misses something crucial about how these conditions might interact. When your nervous system is simultaneously seeking stimulation and requiring calm, managing novelty-seeking impulses while maintaining sensory regulation, the cognitive load appears to be more than just additive. The constant internal negotiation between these competing drives may create an exponentially higher energy expenditure. The simple model suggests that if ADHD burnout takes weeks to resolve and autistic burnout takes months, then combined burnout should just take longer. But this framework overlooks what community reports suggest is the core mechanism. When your brain is running two neurological programs that make contradictory demands, the system eventually crashes from the sustained effort of trying to serve both simultaneously. The neurological reality involves two brain networks processing fundamentally different priorities at the same time. Here's what we know about each condition separately and what this might mean when they occur together. ADHD involves dysregulation in dopamine pathways, particularly in the prefrontal cortex and striatum. This creates what researchers call reward prediction errors. Your brain expects certain activities to provide neurochemical satisfaction, but when environmental stimuli don't deliver the anticipated dopamine response, motivation and focus collapse. The system is constantly seeking the next source of stimulation to maintain baseline functioning. Autism involves differences in sensory processing and neural connectivity patterns. The nervous system processes environmental input differently, often with heightened sensitivity to sensory information. This system functions most efficiently with predictable patterns and controlled sensory input, allowing cognitive resources to be allocated to other tasks rather than constant environmental monitoring. Based on what we understand about each condition, these may function as competing neurological imperatives operating simultaneously in the same brain. The ADHD system broadcasts constant signals for novelty, stimulation, and reward seeking. The autism system simultaneously signals for routine, sensory regulation, and predictable patterns. Every decision becomes an internal negotiation between these contradictory demands. We're still mapping the specific mechanisms, but emerging clinical observations suggest this creates sustained cognitive conflict. Research on stress responses in neurodivergent populations exists primarily for individual conditions. We don't yet have controlled studies examining the physiological impact of managing multiple neurodevelopmental conditions simultaneously. The masking component adds what appears to be another layer of neurological strain. Many people with both conditions report engaging in what could be termed dual masking, simultaneously suppressing ADHD traits like hyperactivity and impulsiveness while camouflaging autistic traits like repetitive behaviors and direct communication styles. This isn't just performing neurotypicality, it's performing two different, often contradictory versions of neurotypicality simultaneously. Dr. Amy Pearson's research at the University of Sunderland demonstrates that autistic masking requires substantial cognitive resources. If we extrapolate from this finding, combined masking might increase energy expenditure significantly, though controlled studies specifically examining dual masking don't yet exist. This remains a hypothesis based on community reports and clinical observations. The critical mechanism, based on current understanding, involves what happens to your autonomic nervous system under this sustained conflict. When you're caught between the ADHD drive for stimulation and the autistic need for sensory regulation, your nervous system may exist in a chronic state of competing demands. You're neither fully stimulated nor truly regulated, but trapped in what many describe as an exhausting middle ground that drains resources without satisfying either set of neurological needs. When this system crashes, it affects multiple domains simultaneously: executive function, sensory processing, emotional regulation, and basic self care abilities. Recovery appears to require rebuilding not just energy reserves, but the entire regulatory system that's been fundamentally overwhelmed by managing contradictory neurological drives. The research landscape reveals significant limitations in our understanding of dual autism ADHD presentations. The DSM-5 only began allowing concurrent diagnosis in 2013, meaning most adults experiencing this combination grew up without understanding their neurological makeup. Much of our knowledge comes from clinical observations and self-report studies rather than controlled experimental research. Dr. Dora Raymaker's foundational 2020 study on autistic burnout included only 19 participants, a sample size that limits generalizability. ADHD burnout research is even more sparse, with most evidence emerging from clinical observations rather than systematic study. When we examine both conditions together, we're often working with case studies and community reports rather than robust experimental data. The replication challenges are significant. Many findings about neurodivergent burnout come from small, self-selected samples that may not represent the broader population of people with these conditions. The terminology itself remains inconsistent across research contexts, with AuDHD primarily used in community spaces rather than clinical literature. Gender presentations add complexity that research is only beginning to address. Studies suggest that women and non-binary individuals with autism show higher rates of internalizing symptoms and camouflaging behaviors. When combined with ADHD, this may create burnout patterns that present as anxiety or depression rather than recognizable neurodivergent exhaustion, leading to diagnostic confusion and inappropriate treatment approaches. Sensory processing differences reveal particularly puzzling patterns during burnout. Some individuals report decreased sensory sensitivity, becoming numb to input that would normally overwhelm them. Others experience heightened hypersensitivity that makes basic environmental navigation impossible. Dr. Lucy Jane Miller's research at the Star Institute suggests this might relate to different subtypes of sensory processing differences, but we lack sufficient data to predict which individuals will experience which pattern. The cyclical nature of AuDHD burnout presents another research challenge. Unlike neurotypical burnout, which typically follows linear patterns of stress, exhaustion, and recovery, many people report repeated cycles where they appear to recover, return to normal functioning, then crash again within months. This might relate to the fact that the underlying neurological conflict remains unresolved, but longitudinal studies tracking these patterns don't yet exist. Trauma history complicates the clinical picture significantly. Many neurodivergent adults have experienced chronic invalidation, academic struggles, social rejection, and employment difficulties. Dr. Pete Walker's work on complex PTSD suggests these experiences create their own pattern of nervous system dysregulation that can become entangled with neurodivergent burnout, making it difficult to distinguish between trauma responses and neurological exhaustion. If you recognize this pattern in your own experience, the primary implication is validation. Your burnout recovery isn't following standard timelines because you're managing a genuinely complex neurological situation that most recovery frameworks weren't designed to address. Traditional burnout advice assumes a single nervous system that can be restored through rest and stress reduction. But when your brain is managing competing drives for stimulation and regulation simultaneously, rest alone won't resolve the underlying conflict. Recovery appears to require what might be called neurological accommodation, finding ways to honor both sets of needs rather than forcing one to dominate the other. This often means creating environments and routines that seem contradictory, quiet spaces where you can engage in stimulating activities, or predictable schedules that include built in novelty. The goal isn't eliminating the conflict between your ADHD and autistic needs, but reducing the energy cost of managing that conflict daily. Many people report that their neurological needs fluctuate throughout the day or across longer cycles. Rather than fighting these shifts, sustainable recovery involves developing what researchers call flexible responsiveness, adjusting your environment and activities based on your current neurological state rather than forcing consistency. The masking component requires particular attention during recovery. Burnout often strips away your ability to maintain the neurotypical performance you may have relied on for years. While this can feel destabilizing initially, many people find that this forced authenticity ultimately leads to more sustainable ways of functioning. Support systems present unique challenges. Most therapeutic approaches focus on either ADHD management or autism support, but rarely address their intersection. Finding clinicians who understand dual presentations or connecting with others who share similar experiences can be crucial for recovery validation. The timeline implications are perhaps most important. Community reports and anecdotal evidence suggest that meaningful AuDHD burnout recovery typically involves months to years rather than weeks. This isn't a failure of effort or self-care. It appears to be the realistic time frame for rebuilding a regulatory system that's been chronically overwhelmed by managing contradictory neurological demands. Recovery often involves fundamental changes in how you structure work, relationships, and daily life, rather than simply returning to previous functioning levels. This extended timeline reflects the complexity of the neurological situation you're managing, not inadequate recovery efforts. AuDHD burnout appears to emerge from a specific neurological reality, managing simultaneous drives for stimulation and regulation that create sustained cognitive conflict. The ADHD need for novelty and dopamine driven reward seeking operates alongside autistic requirements for sensory regulation and predictable patterns, forcing your nervous system into constant internal negotiation. When this system becomes overwhelmed, recovery follows different patterns than either condition alone: longer timelines, more complex accommodation needs, and fundamental changes in how you structure your daily life. The goal isn't eliminating the neurological conflict, but learning to manage it more efficiently, reducing the energy cost of being a brain that runs two different operating systems simultaneously. Your exhaustion reflects the genuine complexity of your neurological situation, not a failure of resilience or recovery skills.